In what might be considered to be another Match of the Year candidate, Swerve Strickland and Will Ospreay deliver in the main event of Forbidden Door. What's going on, everybody? My name is Jose Ramos Jr. Welcome back to another episode of the J Area Podcast. And on today's episode of the podcast, we will be reviewing and recapping the events that transpired during AEW's Forbidden Door. Now, I would be remiss to not talk about that main event first and foremost. I look at the way this pay-per-view was structured, and there was a little bit of hesitancy on my part in regards to the build-up to the pay-per-view itself. But after watching Collision and watching the weigh-in between Strickland and Will Ospreay, that really sold it for me. For me, watching those two interact with one another, it really felt like a big fight feel. And that in itself did it for me. That was enough. If anything, as long as that main event were to deliver, give or take whatever were to happen with the undercard and all the other matches that were advertised for Forbidden Door. As long as the main event of Swerve versus Ospreay delivered, then I would be a happy fan. And boy, did it deliver. In what I think is not only the best match of the year, I think quite frankly, this Will Ospreay versus Swerve Strickland matchup, it might just be my favorite match in all of AEW's history. For the longest, my favorite matchup was Dustin Rhodes versus Cody Rhodes at the first ever Double or Nothing event in 2019. Just the story that was told, the match itself, the moments, the memories, the emotion that was experienced during that brother versus brother matchup, I thought it couldn't be topped. And then we have the athleticism, again, the story, the emotion, the gravity that was felt throughout this main event of Ospreay versus Swerve. It really felt, as I mentioned in a previous episode, it really felt like it was potentially the changing of the guard. There was a moment where it felt like whoever was going to win this match, whoever was going to walk out as the AEW World Champion, they would be the face of the company. And obviously, when you hold a company's world title, it comes with the territory. But it really felt like this was a moment in time where we would look back at this moment in AEW's history and find out who would be the leader of this latest iteration of the company. Because the company has gone through a little bit of a transitional period multiple times over. And to see the work, the quality of work that a Swerve Strickland and a Will Ospreay were able to put forth in this main event. It was Will Ospreay's first ever main event in AEW. Swerve Strickland, not a stranger to it, as he's successfully defeated Samoa Joe and Christian Cage for these titles, or for the title, I should say. And I just look at it, and I feel like it checked all the boxes. You look at the story that they were telling. These two were evenly matched. We had multiple instances during the matchup where both were countering one another, that the opponent couldn't get the upper hand. We saw a flurry of offenses being perfectly defended by the opposition. We saw false finishes. We saw a swerve stomp onto the announce table. We saw the inclusion of Don Callis and a potential attack with a screwdriver by Will Ospreay. Ultimately, he would throw the screwdriver away and fight a clean match. But just throughout the duration of the main event, I kept thinking to myself, they have to have Swerve win. I didn't see Will Ospreay winning, but there were a few of those false finishes that had me thinking otherwise. Big props to Ospreay, big props to Swerve Strickland. I look forward to what they do moving forward in both of their stories. Obviously, we know that Will Ospreay will be defending the AEW International Championship against Daniel Garcia on this week's episode of Dynamite Beach Break. But I just can't help but sing the praises of this matchup. You look at all the intangibles, all the aspects, and all the characteristics of the match. They really were able to take their time with it, and I'm glad that AEW was so willing to give them abundance of time in terms of that main event slot. You had them build up to it. There were moments where it would slow down and it would pick up. and it would slow down and gather and then pick up. And finally, that last 5 minute span of the matchup is really, for me, what cemented it as one of the best matches that I've seen. And I would put it up against the Cody versus Dustin matchup. I obviously, with being a recency bias, obviously I'm going to throw it up there as one of the best I've seen. Maybe give it some time, give it a rewatch, as well as rewatching that Double or Nothing matchup between the brothers. Maybe my opinion changes back to Dustin and Cody, but for the time being, I feel very confident in saying that this was one of the best matches. I think other than that Will Ospreay versus Bryan Danielson matchup at Dynasty, if it wasn't for that match, this is a clear-cut match of the year. Clear-cut. For AEW's sake, obviously, you have to take into consideration the work that the WWE has been putting in, New Japan, even TNA. But for AEW's sake, this was a marquee match. It's a match that we will all remember. Put a pin in it. Remember the date, June 30th, 2024. I think this is going to be one of those marquee matches that we look back on when we see these highlight packages, these rewinds of the history of the company. This is certainly one that I think will be included, and rightfully so. But I would be remiss to not mention other matches that really put up a good fight in terms of match of the night. I think one of the first ones that comes to mind, of course, was the ladder match for the vacant TNT title. If you watched my predictions video last week, you would know that I had selected Jack Perry as the winner of the ladder match, and what happened? The scapegoat actually came through, and he won it cleanly. And I thought that was very important for not only his character, but furthering that story of the Elite. He didn't have any assistance from the Young Bucks or from Okada or from this supposed wild card that they have in mind. He won it on his own. He won it cleanly, and I think it was the right choice. I thought that was a great matchup. Anytime you have a multi-man ladder match, it's hard to mess those things up. But aside from that, one match that really caught my attention was the winner-take-all Mercedes Mone versus Stephanie Vaquer for the New Japan Strong Women's title, as well as the TBS title. Again, heading into the match, I had my expectations. I understood that these two women are among one of the better women's wrestlers the world has to offer, but just the story that they were telling, and not only that, but the crowd's reaction and their interaction, their participation. This crowd, being in Long Island, New York, was very anti-Mercedes and very pro-Stephanie. You would hear them boo at some points in the match. You would hear them boo almost every offensive maneuver that Mercedes had to offer, and they would heavily cheer for Stephanie. Anytime that it seemed like Mercedes was going to put the match away by locking in a submission hold or getting a pinfall, they booed heavily. Every time Stephanie kicked out, it was just nothing but cheers. It was even to the point where Mercedes, who is from Boston, the crowd was having chants saying, F the Celtics. They had F the Red Sox. Very anti-Boston crowd. And the hate that they were giving Mercedes, I'm not sure if it was for Mercedes specifically, or was it just because of that Boston and New York rivalry. Nevertheless, that participation, whenever a crowd is heavily involved and is as hot as they were for that match, for me personally, it only elevates the atmosphere. It makes it all the more interesting. I thought those two put on a hell of a matchup. And for some time, I thought Toni Storm and Mina had the match of the night for the women, of course. But not to take away from Toni Storm and Mina, both having their own respective stories, I thought the women really shined in this pay-per-view event. I thought it was great. And then obviously, the women's division gets a big boost by the return of Britt Baker, DMD, and it appears that she has her eyes set on the TBS champion, now the Strong Women's champion, Mercedes Mone, which should be a fun matchup, I think. I think, obviously, if we're going based off of the heel versus babyface dynamics, where a lot of times in wrestling it might not be as conventional as it was, I think Mercedes as the natural heel, Britt Baker representing AEW, probably should be displayed as a babyface. I think that's going to end up being your women's matchup for the TBS title at the All-In event at Wembley Stadium. And with the proper build it should be one of the most anticipated matchups, even without a proper build. Just these two stars, us knowing what they're capable of, the reputation preceding them, it is going to be a marquee match for that event. But again, stories really make the match. And if you watch professional wrestling long enough, obviously we want to see the action, we want to see the match, but it's all about leading up to it. How did we get there? Why are these two fighting? And obviously, these are two of the top women's wrestlers in the world vying for one of the top spots in that company, AEW. It's not the women's world title, but it is a premier title, the TBS title. So looking forward to that aspect. Speaking of championships, we also had Jon Moxley defending the IWGP World Heavyweight Championship against Naito in another matchup that I anticipated to be a hard-hitting matchup, which it was. And that's what I like about the AEW pay-per-view events. Say what you will about Tony Khan and the presentation of AEW, but it was always intended to be the alternative to WWE. And what pro wrestling is really thriving on at this moment is being able to offer a buffet of sort in terms of wrestling. If you're in the mood for something like WWE and the style that they present, they have their shows on their schedule. You also have AEW, you have New Japan, you have TNA Wrestling, a little bit of everything. And when I watch a AEW pay-per-view, I can already expect to have a hard-hitting matchup like Moxley, to have an athletic competition between main eventers like Swerve and Will Ospreay, high-flying like in the ladder match, technical prowess like Zack Sabre Jr. or Bryan Danielson, which we will talk about in a moment. But the Jon Moxley matchup, which I want to cover briefly, was hard-hitting. And I think it was the right call to have Naito win back the the IWGP World Heavyweight Championship, bringing it back to New Japan. Jon Moxley had his little run with the title, and he did what he did with the title. But I thought it was smart to have that title change hands and have him bring it back to New Japan, as I just mentioned. As I mentioned, Jon Moxley, I think one of the best stars that AEW has to offer, but just the matchup that they had, and you could see what was in store for Jon. Naito, ever so much the psychological advantage in the matchup. You could see how he was playing the role of that irritant. He was just trying to get under the skin of Jon, spitting at him multiple times throughout the matchup, and guys like Jim Ross and Nigel McGuinness pointed that out as if it wasn't really a smart tactic. You were only going to infuriate and piss off Jon Moxley even more. But it got to the point where he was so overzealous, where he was so frustrated that he lost sight of what he was doing, and ultimately Naito was able to get the upper hand and win back that world title. Another matchup that I thought probably had the potential to be a match of the night candidate, but when you have other matches on the card, as I previously mentioned, it makes it all the more difficult to do so. And speaking of match of the night qualities, one of the early contenders for me personally was that Orange Cassidy versus Zack Sabre Jr. matchup, and what was a contrast of styles and something that I was kind of iffy about. I wasn't sure what to expect from it. I know Zack Sabre Jr. has the ability to display his technical prowess, as he's one of the best technical wrestlers in the world. And Orange Cassidy, to me, is really an anomaly, because there are these moments where he has these offensive maneuvers which have a lack of energy, if you will. But then he has these quick spurts of energy where he's bouncing off the rope, hitting these tilt-a-whirl DDTs, and it was just a fantastic matchup. And I love that they've been capturing this idea that Orange Cassidy has had a bit of a rout in the last couple of months. He's lost seemingly all his best friends and is now on his own. And he even acknowledged this heading into the build of this matchup, saying that it's been really tough for him. And you can see Zack Sabre Jr. mentioning how, you've already beaten me once, and I've been waiting for this one-on-one matchup for a year. He's been preparing mentally, physically, studying all the habits that Orange Cassidy has displayed over the course of the last year, certainly with that lengthy title reign as the international champion. And seeing him being able to incorporate all the lessons that he was able to take away from their last encounter. In fact, at the end of that matchup, where he was able to lock Orange Cassidy in that submission maneuver, basically rendering him useless. All use of his limbs, there was none. He had no way of crawling back to the ropes. He had no way of even submitting. It was to the point where the referee had to call it. There was nothing he can do. Zack Sabre Jr. was on a mission, and I know initially I had predicted Orange Cassidy to win this matchup just because that the AEW, the writing or 20 Con, the booking, have always managed to keep Orange Cassidy protected. They've always presented him as one of their elite, no pun intended, stars. So for me personally, I thought, yeah, they could have him win this matchup, no problem. Zack Sabre Jr. is more than capable of taking this loss and still running with the level of momentum that he had coming into this pay-per-view. But I was very pleasantly surprised to see that they were willing to give Zack Sabre Jr. that rub and give him the victory. Perhaps there's even that opportunity that we could see a rematch between the two. I don't know if it happens, but it's certainly something that I would like to see. And given the association that we've had with Orange Cassidy these last few weeks, I would love to see what's next. We've already seen him encounter Trent Beretta. We've now seen him fought against Zack Sabre Jr. But what's really next for Orange Cassidy? He in himself has become one of the more interesting characters in my book. I know there's some people who are detractors of Orange Cassidy. They don't support the gimmick or they don't understand the gimmick, and that's fine. It's up to your preference. But it is certainly something to keep an eye on because I don't think it will be too long until we see him in the main event scene fighting for that AEW World Championship. And speaking of the AEW World Championship, how can we not talk about the longest reigning AEW World Champion in the company's history, the hometown favorite, MJF. He had the opening matchup against Hechicero, and what I thought was a very smart move. I know, again, I keep referencing the prediction video that I had last week. I thought the ladder match would be the opener just because it's a great way to set the mood and build up the anticipation and get the crowd invested in the night. But obviously, with hindsight being 2020, having MJF being the opening matchup was perfect. He's the hometown, favorite. Everyone loves MJF. He had a great matchup against Hechicero, really demonstrating his physical and athletic prowess as well. We always look at MJF as the kind of guy who's very character driven. He's great in terms of his gimmick, in terms of his persona. He's wonderful on the mic. I think he's second to none. I always try to praise MJF. I think he is probably overall the best wrestler they have in AEW. I think the argument can now be made for Will Ospreay and Swerve Strickland, who, in their own right are fantastic, but they're really coming into their own. And I love seeing the level of success. And I love seeing the level of confidence growing from all of these individuals. So MJF getting that hometown reception and obviously the hometown win is a great move. I think he moves forward now in maybe a feud against Will Ospreay for that international championship at the All In event. I did call that out in last week's episode of the podcast, where there was a little bit of a sour taste in his mouth, if you will. He was having an interaction with Daniel Garcia, and out comes Will Ospreay to intervene and interrupt, and you can tell that it really rubbed MJF the wrong way. So I think that's what, from my understanding, that is the direction we're going to be heading for the MJF and Will Ospreay. And that's something that's certainly going to be fantastic TV, whether it's the promos, whether it's the matchup, whether it's the build. And these are two guys who are very much in line with the heel side of pro wrestling. So to see these two, collide at a pay-per-view, that potentially has a lot of potential, I should say, in being one of the stories of the year, matches of the year. It's going to be really tough to top what we saw as the main event here at Forbidden Door. But another matchup that I thought was another candidate for match of the night. This pay-per-view had a lot of match of the night candidates, I thought. Bryan Danielson. This man loves to put him physically in a position where we're all worried for his sake. He's had a history of neck issues, obviously, the brain issues he's dealt with in the last decade. But the match that he had in the first round of the Owen Hart tournament, again, hard hitting. I already knew that we were going to be seeing him with all red on his chest. Bryan Danielson, one of the greatest wrestlers in the world, certainly one of the best wrestlers I've ever seen in my life, having another great match. And I look forward to seeing his next matchup because he's scheduled in this tournament to face Pac. That is going to be fantastic. I look forward to Dynamite. I look forward to Beach Break. One thing you can always count on with AEW is their match quality. I know there's been a lot of criticism for their stories and their lack of building or whatever you want to call it, but in ring work, AEW is able to consistently present the quality of great wrestling, and that's something I'm looking forward to. Finally, I'll talk about the trios matchup between the Elite versus what they were calling it Scissors Ace by the Acclaimed and Tanahashi. I had fun with it. I thought personally there were times in the match where it was kind of slow, and when you look at it in the grand scheme and you take a back seat or a couple steps back, I should say, and look at it in the grand scheme of the card, it really was something to forget. And that's a shame because the history between Okada and Tanahashi, it really is one of the best matches that they could have presented. Having the people involved, having the Bucks play up to their heelish gimmick. I look forward to how they're going to integrate Jack Perry now that everyone is holding, the gold. Who is this wild card that they keep mentioning? Which, by the way, I will give credit where credit is due. AEW has really sold me on this Jeff Jarrett storyline. For those who aren't familiar or quite frankly forgot, they've made it really apparent to hone in on the history of Jeff Jarrett and his friendship with Owen Hart. He obviously was one of his best friends, and being that it is the Owen Hart tournament, I really am rooting for Jeff Jarrett, which is something I didn't think I would say coming into the year 2024. But being that he's going to be facing some member of the Elite as the wild card, I don't see them having this wild card lose in the first round. And it's a shame. You've been building it up for so much, and it's going to be a one and done. So I'm hoping it's going to be something worthwhile and something great, because ultimately that's what wrestling is all about. We want to have these surprises. We want to have these moments that make us feel something. And I don't know. I don't know. You look at the recent vignette of Adam Page. Could we be seeing him join the Elite? Who knows? It looks like he's going back to his, lonely cowboy gimmick, which was such a hit back in 2020 and 2021. Is it a possibility? It is a possibility for sure. But I don't know if he aligns himself with them. I don't see him as a heel in this moment. He certainly could be confused, and join them at first and then end up fighting against them, joining with his old tag team partner Kenny Omega in the future, maybe. I could definitely see them doing that. But just a lot of interesting details, a lot of interesting storylines that the company could move forward. But as we move forward, we are on the build to All In, as I mentioned, Wembley Stadium. It's the second time they're going to be emanating from Wembley Stadium, the third overall All In event that they're going to be presenting, obviously being last year, and the initial All In event in 2018 that started it all for AEW. But go ahead and sound off in the comments below, guys. Let me know what you thought of the pay-per-view Forbidden Door. What was your favorite match of the year? And whose story are you looking forward to the most as we build to All In? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Keep following the J Area Podcast as we continue to grow in numbers. We recently hit 1,000 subs, and I'm forever thankful for you guys and appreciate the love and support that you've been showing not only me, but the podcast, the videos, and here's to the road on to 2,000. That's the next landmark I would like to hit. But again, of course, my name is Jose Ramos Jr. Thank you for joining me on this quick little recap review of AEW Forbidden Door, and I look forward to seeing you guys on the next episode.